Welcome to another episode of the Coach's Corner. With me again this week, Paul O'Neid. How's it going, man? How's everything treating you in Canada?
Doing as well as I can, considering the ever evolving situation up here, but trying to remain as status quo as I can, working, coaching clients, training, same old same.
When you see the governor of Florida talk about how open it is, how much do you regret moving back to Canada after you were down here in Florida for your master's?
Very much so. Yeah. So for those unfamiliar, we are on house arrest, basically, stay-at-home orders, and the only reasons we're allowed to leave the house are for doctor's appointments and groceries.
And
Otherwise, stay home.
are they, is there like a higher influx of people getting pulled over? Like how are they monitoring that?
No, they haven't put in like roadblocks yet. That's been something that's been proposed. Recently, the government of Ontario put out a survey, and one of the questions actually read, would you consider allowing the government to temporarily restrict your rights and freedoms? That was like actually what the question was. And so the fact that they're asking these types of questions and going down that rabbit hole is quite scary to me as a Canadian, because, when you look at our national anthem, the True North, strong and free, there's not a lot of freedom going on right now. So
I feel like they're asking that question because they kind of want permission, knowing that they're going to do it anyways. So they're just kind of like trying to ease into it. It's like the idea of like ask first and then seek forgiveness later type of deal.
yeah, the rumors that are going around is that they're actually going to reduce the restrictions coming up shortly in terms of, businesses being open. And then in the fall, there's going to be this new variant of COVID-19 that's started to surface itself. I don't know if you've been following the news. And then
No.
and then they're going to use that as an excuse to completely lock everything down.
Nice. Yeah, no, I don't watch the news ever.
I don't.
I didn't even know something happened at the Capitol. Apparently I had no clue. Somebody had to tell me about that. So I appreciate that. I was going to the gym on Saturday just to give a juxtaposed viewpoint. And on my way to the gym, which is in downtown Tampa, and obviously Tampa has the Super Bowl this year, and the Buccaneers are in it. It's the first time a team's ever played in their hometown during the Super Bowl. And there were hundreds and hundreds of people on the Riverwalk, no mask, bumping into each other.
Love
This
it.
was like, I had to like actually pay attention while I was driving because I had a fear of running somebody over because there were just so many people out there celebrating their Bucks jerseys, just celebrating the shit out of life. And I was like, this is crazy.
See, that's like, for me, I'm more on the libertarian side. I'm like, let me do whatever I want as long as I don't hurt other people. And so a lot of what's going on up here definitely plays in the face of that. And yeah, it's very communist, very sad.
Well, I mean, you know, I understand like the idea of libertarian, but then that's also putting control into human beings who have not necessarily been shown to make the best decisions.
I don't disagree with you. The problem comes into the role of the government has never been to protect people from themselves.
Should be, maybe. I don't know. That should be maybe thought about a little,
That's
a
what's
little bit
happening.
more.
But that's the excuse they're giving right now for all the
Right, right.
regulations.
Yeah,
It's,
because if you give people the freedom of choice to do stuff, how likely are they going to choose to do the right thing a lot of times? And that's one of the biggest problems. I mean, that's why religion was created, was to kind of book down those people making those choices, right? If you have some type of consequence for the negative choices in your life, like going to hell, then maybe you'll become a better person, right? The idea of like you can just treat people good without having to create a religion or having to create laws is like that's just impossible. You can't do it. It's unheard of.
No, I don't disagree with you on that. I'm still learning and formulating my own philosophies on things and how I really feel about them. There's just something very, very unsettling about what the government is doing up here, and I mean, it's borderline scary. They've implemented mandatory quarantine. Like if you travel from anywhere in the world and it's non-essential and you come back to Canada, you have a mandatory quarantine at your own expense at a government hotel.
I saw that. It's
And then
amazing.
if you test negative, or sorry, if you test positive, waiting for your test, you're transferred to a government isolation center. And yeah, the story, like they're not telling people where their spouses are if they're taking them to these places. The police aren't giving out their badge numbers or their names to the people inquiring. It's a very, very scary state of affairs.
Now, is it scary just because it's such the juxtaposed idea of what you thought you had as far as a citizen in Canada goes? Is it just because it's the complete opposite that it's scary that they have that kind of control that they can implement that just at the snap of a finger whenever they want to? Is that the scary thing? Like what's so scary
Yeah,
about it? I mean, do you see the positives in it as well? Like they're trying to.
I don't, because the data that I've seen, and albeit I don't research this heavily, but the data that I've seen has shown that the lockdowns aren't decreasing our numbers.
Yeah,
They're using cases as a means to evaluate success of these interventions, but the tests that we're using to determine cases are unreliable, and that's been
right,
shown over and over. So the means are not validated by the data. If it was like, hey, what we're doing is helping save people's lives, I wouldn't have
right,
a problem.
for
But
sure.
they can't prove that.
No.
Um, and the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result, and they just keep putting more and more and more and more restrictions on us, and numbers keep coming up. And
Yeah.
the numbers of cases are coming up, and our hospitalizations are quite stable.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because just playing devil's advocate, but it's like you never know what you're seeing on TV to be the truth, and that's the scary
Totally.
thing anymore. Because I had a friend come down, and in her state, if you went to a place that was over 15% for COVID type cases, then
Yep.
you had to quarantine for 2 weeks. And Florida is one of the most open states you can go to, and it was still below 15%. So the numbers
Yeah,
would indicate,
I saw
yeah,
a graph like that. It was like California was the most restricted, and it was like twice as many cases per 100,000 as Florida did.
yeah,
That's, I mean,
it's interesting.
I guess I'm moving to Florida with all that. Isn't it like 1,000 people a day are moving to Florida right now? That's what I
Um,
heard.
I hope not. I don't know. I haven't seen it. I haven't seen an influx in traffic yet. So far, so good. The great thing about living in Tampa is not a lot of people find Tampa as like that destination spot in Florida. They'll
Yeah.
move to like stupid cities. Like Tim from Ritual moved to fucking Daytona. It's like you move to a college party town and you
It's a
expect it
shithole.
right. It's so bad.
Yeah.
So people move to those places like Daytona and Miami and Fort Lauderdale. And it's like, good luck with that. Those places suck, man.
I love Tampa. I think it's great. I love the downtown area, like Hyde Park area. It's super nice, and
Yeah.
I would definitely move back there.
Well, I already told you.
I know. I
So,
know.
anyways. So we were talking a little bit about your training and
Yep.
the idea that you can't keep yourself healthy. So,
It's not so much that I can't keep myself healthy. It's that there are, whenever you're dealing with imbalance, let's call it an imbalance. So I have a significant hip shift in the squat, and it's been something that's quite chronic. So my body has just simply adapted to moving that way, regardless of whether it causes me pain or not. So
right.
you look back at my last couple of meets that I've done, the meet that I had the least amount of pain and I think performed the best regardless of circumstances was the meet I did November of last year before the showdown. So the showdown, I think I squatted 6 pounds more or something like that. But the meet in November, I had no pain. It's because I literally squatted twice before the meet. And so for me, it's finding ways to increase my squat without squatting, and the times that I am squatting to make sure that I'm as symmetrical as possible. So right now I'm taking an approach of, smallest possible exposure. So I'm only doing 3 sets of squatting a week, and it's with a pause. focusing on feeling even tension throughout. But as I correct the pattern, I have a left hip that's dysfunctional and that I'm trying to fix. But that means my right hip hasn't gone through the proper range of motion for a symmetrical squat in a significant amount of time. So as my left hip resolves and gets more out of pain, I'm starting to have some discomfort in my right hip. So it's finding a balance between like what's the appropriate amount of exposure to this squat movement, and how to keep building my leg strength, how to keep, pushing the other elements of training. So I think I have a good blend right now. It's just knowing where to draw the line of like how to push too far, not push enough. I mean, as long as I'm able to train and live life, I'm okay. I exaggerate a little bit. I can walk and I'm not like super crippled, but it gets frustrating, but it's all part of the journey, I guess you could say. It's part of the process.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it is kind of a sport that requires bilateral movements in copious amounts, and understanding that we're asymmetrical people can always lead to some type of dysfunction down the road. So my question to you then would be, well, one, what kind of work are you doing to make sure that your right hip is able to handle that load and range of motion before it actually had to? And then also, why not just move your squats to like once every other week or something like that? Why would you have to do, if you got away with only squatting twice at a meet that you felt the best at, and then the next meet you only added 6 pounds to it by squatting a lot, and
Yeah.
why not squat like once every 3 weeks, once every 4 weeks?
So that's a good question. So when I say I only squatted twice, I did 3 weeks of front squats, 3 weeks of high bar squats, and then 2 weeks of low bar.
So is
So
it
I was squatting every week, but it's actually it's uh, squat movements in which the bar is on my back, and I have to be in that shoulder external rotation because my left shoulder doesn't seem to get under the bar as well.
So it's your left shoulder, and now your right hip's having issues.
Part of it.
Well, it's a big part of it. Why don't you fix your left shoulder?
I'm working on it.
For how long? You've had this problem forever. That's the thing, right? It's like, what does that work look like? What does it, what
Exactly.
does it entail? That type of stuff, right? Just kind of thinking out loud, trying to run through your process in your mind.
So right now, my lower body work is focused on, because of the previous tears I've had to my quad and my T-band, I have an off-center gait cycle. So instead of actually using my glute to lock out my left hip, I use lumbar extension. So I don't actually go into full hip extension on that side. So trying to fix that, do a bit of breath work and core work to address that left side and be able to feel my oblique working. And that's made a huge difference in terms of balance side to side and how I hinge into the squat. In terms of the upper body work, there's some mobility stuff I've been doing to kind of free up my posterior capsules very tight. So I've been doing some FRC stuff. So some pales and rails contractions to try and get more external rotation, free up that capsule. And then doing more work overhead, things like, overhead bicep curls, overhead tricep extensions, making sure that any type of overhead pulling movement is done with from a dead hang into retraction, staying in my lats the whole time. And just more attention to detail on that front. The interesting thing is that left shoulder has never been an issue on my bench press, which I feel if there was an issue on the shoulder, it would manifest in my bench press, but maybe.
Why do you think that, right? If you think about the posterior sling where your lat and your left shoulder attaches to your hip and your glute on the right side, why would that have anything to do with your anterior shoulder having any type of shoulder pain or dysfunction? That dysfunction is going to present itself in the hip more than anything else, because the shoulder is the dysfunction that's creating that hip dysfunction and pulling on it, not so much that the shoulder is creating dysfunction within that bench press movement.
Well, my thought process would be that if I couldn't keep that scapula in its proper orientation on my rib cage while bench pressing, I would flare out super early and end up, in that really internally rotated lockout position.
Mm-hmm.
but it hasn't really done that. So that was kind of why I was surprised. I feel like that would be kind of the next level of manifestation, but
Don't count it out yet, sir. There's still plenty of time.
It's improving. It's improving.
That's good.
What I would like to start including is actual work on the low bar squat, like just spending more time low bar squatting. A big thing for me, I think, will be being able to widen my hands and still find that shelf on my back, because that's always been an issue for me. I feel like I have to be in tight in order to feel my lats turn on and like everything be tight and have that rack position. So if I can move my hands out, put less stress on that shoulder, I think I'll be able to get in a better position and have less of a shift.
Yeah.
So that's going to be something I include once I've got the pain a little bit more managed. I can get through sessions fine, but the soreness lingers for like probably a day or two.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas before it would linger all week. So
yeah,
I'm in a way better position now.
You talked about the idea of like training your obliques and breath work and that type of stuff. And then you talked about training your hips and legs, and you do a lot of the training separately. When do you start to integrate it all together to build it in a more of an integrative manner instead of thinking about doing it in a separate manner? Because like you said, your issue comes with gait cycling, which, right? So why wouldn't you think about the additional of movements that would improve gait cycling and would incorporate the integration of the hip, the core, and the shoulder all in one movement?
So right now, the two core movements that I'm doing are, or that I'm doing most consistently as part of my rehab, are a bench elevated dead bug, where I'm in hip flexion on one side and hip extension on the other, hip and knee flexion on the other side. So it'd be like in the bottom of a lunge would be the finishing position, and then a split stance pal-off press. So I am in that gait cycle position for those. But when I start to integrate it, I was talking about, doing more low bar squatting. I will include that once I'm more under control with regards to pain. Because I don't want to be, even if it's part of the rehab process, I just don't want to be, if it's going to trigger me, I don't want to be in pain. And I have no rush to do it.
Yeah.
So so I do the one squat movement and then belt squats, which don't seem to bother me unless I go too heavy like I did last week. And then split squats. So a lot of split squats on the menu. So it's everything you're saying makes total sense, and it's all part of the process. I probably should have elaborated on exactly what I was doing, but it's been an interesting. I've gone through everything with this knee. Like I've done soft tissue at the yin yang. First I've had multiple surgeries. I've had a surgery on each side. I've torn both quads, torn my left hip. So there's a lot of damage in there. I've torn both pecs, torn my left calf.
Did you ever think like, man, maybe this is not the sport for me? Everything's torn.
No, it's the only thing I've ever been really good at.
Oh, so it's worth pursuing to the detriment of your own health. I like it. I appreciate that.
There are worse things in life. I took up mountain biking this summer. I did that and ended up falling off a bridge. That was fun.
Did the mountain biking bother your knee?
Nope.
No.
Biking seems to be okay. It really is anything bilateral with that shoulder and external rotation. So like when I do safety bar squats, my hip shift is significantly less. But because it was so flared up from going through that partial prep for hybrid, it was even bad doing safety bar. So I'm kind of having to work backwards from that.
Yeah, I got you. Yeah, I would just think, right, like if it is something that has the external rotation component and it's causing that hip shift, that it would be more or less looking at the posterior sling and then fixing things through that dynamic more so in an integrative manner. So thinking of like some type of single arm overhead Bulgarian split squat, right, contralaterally, and then trying to do some ipsilaterally, and that way you're constantly incorporating that sling from the posterior side all the way down, and it could be a lat thing as well. So doing more of that, the lat type stuff where you're biasing more of the lat function to help counter some of that anti-rotation, and then also working on that shoulder to improve its mobility. But the idea that you are adding these things in, but then you're not incrementally adding in low bar maybe once every 3 weeks to see if it's fixing the issue. Do you think that's something that you would like? How do you know what you're doing is fixing it if you don't incorporate that movement pattern that exasperates it every now and then?
For me, it's pain. It's like I just want to get out of pain and then see if I can start including it.
Okay.
My thought was if I can do some low bar on my deload week, just some light low bar to see how it feels in the deload week. So that'll be not next week, but the week after. See if I can work it in. But as far as the split stance, incorporating, the split stance with pressing and lunging, have been doing like a lot of split stance landmine pressing and spending more time in that position. I do find like even when I was introduced to that split stance Palloff press, the difference in sides was ridiculous.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so wild. And like if I do any type of like a kettlebell windmill, one side's like completely different than the other.
Yeah.
I can't even believe how bad it got.
So I just would wonder if you can bring those things to more of a symmetrical disposition, would that benefit the health? That'd be interesting. So I guess as you're adding these things in and you add the low bar in, it'd be great to get some follow-up on that.
Definitely. I'm definitely going through a lot of detail in my log on Coach's Corner University about kind of the things I'm doing. Actually, for this coming week, I did a full squat training session from like warm up to cool down, everything in between.
Nice.
And kind of give a background of like why I'm doing each thing. And so hopefully people get some value out of that. I know it's been really eye-opening for me. It's frustrating as a coach, especially I feel as though I've garnered a reputation as someone who's like good at problem solving for people, to have so many problems myself.
That's how you become good at problem solving.
Exactly. But it also, at the beginning, when I first started getting all these injuries, I was like, yo, is this going to affect my credibility here? Because I'm a big believer that you are your business card. So if I'm the injury guy who's always injured, it doesn't bode well for me.
Right. I say that all the time. Like if you're a coach and you have a coach, same thing. It's like, why would I hire you? I'm just going to hire the coach that you hired. Clearly you think he's a better choice than you. So I think about that all the time too. It's with the injuries, I guess it's the idea of like, well, if your clients aren't getting injured, then at least you're not fucking them up, right? You're just fucking yourself up, which, is
so
not.
I don't fuck them up. I fuck me up so you don't get fucked up.
Right. Because I hear Shallow talk about that, right? He's torn a few things here and there. And that's just part of the sport when you're trying to pursue it at a high level. You have a tendency to overlook some of the pain and kind of push through it until it's too late, regardless of how smart you are. But if you're not, as long as you're able to not do that with your clients, then your reputability kind of stays where it's at. But one of the things you said, to go back to like this idea of reputability, is like you do have a coach right now. And then you said within your coach's log, you're outlining why you're doing the things that you're doing. Is that based off of what you're doing, or is that based off of what your coach is telling you to do? Or is there an integrative process between the two of you?
Oh, it's very collaborative.
Okay.
It's very collaborative, especially with the squat, and the squat itself has been a lot of my direction, because there's certain things that just don't work. Like we were undulating volume and intensity during that hybrid prep, and he wanted me low bar squatting every week, and I was like, can't do it.
Yeah,
just can't. So even on the fly, I would just switch to safety bar, let him know what I was doing and kind of why I was doing it. As far as the correctives and stuff, the suggestion, the dead bug suggestion was his, but everything else is from an athletic trainer I've been working with, who's been very, very helpful. She's actually going to contribute to Coach's Corner. Her name's Jen Bushel. And as far as like the cool down stuff, the walking, the lifestyle type stuff that I've included, that's all me and what I would recommend to anyone else who's going through something like this. So it's a very much a collaborative approach with my coach, and I'm grateful that it's been that way. But it's an ever evolving process. Like last, I guess spring, summer, I was in zero pain, squatting 3 times a week, and everything was good.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden, this pain came on as soon as the weights went. As soon as I started front squatting over 400 and squatting over 5 in the same week, done.
Mm.
So it's like, okay, there's this definite threshold here of tolerance. How do I either stay within it or slowly, incrementally bring it up?
Build it. Yeah. Yeah,
So,
the idea of building tissue tolerance. Also, too, with the amount of walking you're doing, if it is a gait cycle issue, I would think maybe you would try to find someone to help with your gait cycle as well. Right? If you're doing 10,000 steps a day and you have a gait cycle issue that could be causing this problem, maybe looking outside of the scope of an powerlifting.
already done.
Yeah.
I already wear orthotics. I already it's been.
Orthotics are so bad for you if you look at the literature on them, but that's neither here nor there, man. You have your orthotics on, that's fine. But if you look at the literature, help. They don't. If you look at the literature on them, they actually they exasperate things immensely. You just get used to them, but they're actually been shown time and time again to be significantly worse than if you it's like the idea of like, you're not actually fixing what's going on. You're just putting something there to fix it artificially, but you're not actually fixing it. You're not getting your feet stronger. You're not actually fixing the issue, right? So then you artificially do it, and that creates more of a gait cycle issue.
So what does that have anything to do with frequency of wear? Like, is it people who wear it all day, every day?
No.
Oh, it's really like intermittent use.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah. If you look at anyone that actually specializes in foot, and from an athletic standpoint, they would tell you that orthotics is possibly the worst thing you could actually do to improve gait cycle and to improve foot health.
Interesting. I started using them after I tore my quad because I was finding, so I have no lateral meniscus on either side. So I was finding that no matter what I did, even if I was like a 700-pound squatter at 500 pounds, I couldn't maintain my knee position over my foot at the bottom of the squat, regardless of how much supplemental work I did to address adductors, glutes, and anything within that. And then as soon as I put them on, it was like, oh, I can squat again.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the idea of like, if you squat with the heel to hit depth, if you don't squat with the heel, you can't hit depth. Same thing, right? Same kind of Band-Aid you're putting on something to fix it. I mean, if it's a morphological issue, that's one thing, right? Like if your bone structure doesn't allow you to do the squat in the way that you want to do it, where you feel the strongest, then you can compensate that. But is it ever the best choice? Probably not, right? But we're idiots. We're just like, whatever allows me to lift the most weight, I'll compromise everything else beyond that.
That's a whole other conversation, my friend.
All right, let's get to some questions here. We have some that lasted from last week with Christian. One of the questions was how to choose the right intensity for a given number of reps. Very broad statement. He's from Italy, and his English isn't the greatest. But I would assume that the question is more geared towards, how intensity maybe in terms of load. One way to look at it, and then also intensity is like how close you get to failure within that set. So I would definitely think of it in terms of load more so than intensity closer to failure. So let's answer it that way first. Like, how do you pick the right amount of load for the given number of reps, thinking in terms of like a percentage-based program, right? What are some of the structures that you have in place that allow you to know that this percentage should elicit this amount of reps within that given paradigm of the adaptation you're looking to stimulate?
So I'm always looking, I'll use Prelipin's chart as kind of like a jump off point.
Yeah.
And if you look at the chart, it's pretty flexible. Like if when I did that presentation on the 5x5, so 25 total reps would be applicable for anything between 60% and 80%. So you have
Right.
20% of intensity to work with at that point. So that's the jump off point, but ultimately the goal is always to be able to do more, whether it's regards to the load on the bar or the repetitions with it. So Prelipin's chart is your jump off point, but as long, like if you're not testing maxes as you progress through, your goal is always to be able to do, okay, well, I was able to do 70% for 20 reps. Next time I go through, I want to be able to do 72.5 for 20 reps. And that should always continue to be climbing. I mean, up into a point, you're not going to be doing 50 reps at 80%. But that's, yeah, I would just use Prelipin's chart as a jump off point and then continue to progress your intensities within the repetition number that you're looking at.
How old is that chart? Do you know?
A bazillion years old.
And it's based off of Olympic lifting, correct?
Yeah. So usually what you'll see is that the numbers that are tolerated for powerlifting movements, because they're not explosive, will typically be at the highest end of that.
Yeah.
So at 80%, you're looking at like 30 reps, 25 to 30 reps is most appropriate. But even at like, I think about me doing 30 reps at 80% on say a deadlift or a squat, I'd have to train for that, like to get to that point.
Right.
But especially with younger lifters, that 80% for a 5x5, 6x6 kind of would be the top end range of that.
Yeah.
But that chart's been, and I remember learning about that in, I think, grad school when I started really diving into Westside.
Yeah. Yeah. So then how antiquated are these ideas and these thought processes, right? Like a lot of people espouse Philippines chart. A lot of people espouse, the Russian literature from the 70s, Mazdiev and all these
Yep.
people. And it's like, have we not evolved in terms of our ability to coach and train people? Right? Do you feel like those things are antiquated? Because I know a lot of the new research now that's coming out is based on reps in reserve, velocity stops, and RPEs in order to judge the intensity of the exercise. And that's actually been shown a lot of times in the research to be far better and more indicative of your ability to perform. So why do we choose to, because I don't use percentages. I know some people do, but why do we choose to use things that are so antiquated? You always hear people, quote, these are, Bondarchuk and Mavdiev and all these people. It's like, yeah, that was from this, like, have we not progressed? I guess would be the question.
I don't think it's a matter of not progressing, because like humans definitely have not progressed in the last 30 years. Like we haven't evolved as organisms.
But we've gotten a lot stronger.
That's true. So have other things. But in terms of like the methodologies, the reason I use Prelipin's chart, the reason I suggested it is because it would be a starting point. It'd be somewhere to base your basic progression off of. But once you go beyond that, yeah, I totally agree. The research suggests reps in reserve, RPE, velocity base is going to be more appropriate because it auto regulates for the lifter. So on days when they feel the best, they're going to get the best type of training stimulus for them. And on days when they're not feeling their best, they're still going to get an appropriate training stimulus. Where I find, these benchmarks previously set by those authors that you mentioned important is when looking at starting points when you try to establish like total volumes within a week. Because what ends up happening is, okay, you assign 3 sets of 6 at an RPE of 7.
Mm-hmm.
Well, is that 3 sets of 6 to an RPE of 7 top set? Is it 3 sets of 6 RPE 7 across? Is it of these 3, you can do multiple sets of 6 and you just have to get 3 that are RPE of 7. So in total of the whole week, how many actual meaningful sets of work are we getting done? When you're using a percentage-based system, it's much easier to calculate that. It's much easier to progress that week to week.
Right. But why not integrate both?
Which is what I do.
Yeah.
Like I give a percentage range and then I give an RPE. So
I've heard somebody say that that's not a good way to do it, but I agree. I think that's a great way. But I was thinking more or less like, so we want to use RPE to teach the lifter how to gauge how they feel that day. So why not do like an RPE 8 for a single? And then based off of what you got that single, that would be where you base your percentages for that day. So you're getting percentages based off of that RPE for what you can do that day. Do you think that would elicit the same training adaptation as, right? So let's say you feel bad that day and your best squat is 405 and 80% of 405 is whatever number that is. I'm not going to say it because I'll butcher it, right? But say 405 is your best and 80% and you want to do a 3x3 at 80%, right? And that's the training adaptation that you want. But you go into the gym that day and you do a single and it projects out to be 365. So then you do 80% of that. Is that still going to give you in your mind the same training adaptations? 80% still 80% to the human body if it's feeling under recovered, or does the load actually matter? Right. I don't know if there's any research to validate any of that. So this is going to be mostly anecdotal, but I was just curious your opinion on it.
So where I see the drawback to a system like that is that single at an RPE of 8 demands a recovery, right? Like that's still a hard single. So you're going to do a hard single and then you might get some post activation for your down sets. I said might. Well, it lasts like 8 minutes.
The literature won't back that up, but
and it won't. I totally agree. Totally agree there. But people will say, "Oh, I did a single, so my down work feels heavier or feels lighter." But that single demands recovery. So for a lifter who is less experienced, say has a max of 405, they might be able to continuously tolerate that heavy single week after week after week. But what you'll start to see is that heavy single, regardless of how that person feels, they'll keep driving it up. Like, oh, a single at 8. Well, last week I hit 600, so I want to hit 605 this week, even if it's going to kill me.
Yep.
So when you apply the system to an actual person, there are some limitations that we have to take into account. But I find for stronger lifters, a system like that is very, very challenging because that heavy single demands recovery. I much prefer giving a little bit more autonomy. And so what I'll actually do is I'll say, if I'm going to do sets of 6, say for you mentioned, okay, so a 3x3 at 80% is what you want. I'll have a lifter work up to a heavy set of 3 and then use a percentage of that would likely land them around 80% of their 1 rep max. So at least they got a heavy set of 3 and then they back off for 2 more sets of 3 or something like that. So that I know I'm always doing triples. And that's been quite effective for me. And then I'll work it to a point where I'll do 3 sets of 3 total, but all of them are at that heaviest set. So there's an increasing intensity as we progress through. In the auto regulation for me is a tough one because very rarely is an athlete mature enough to actually apply it to themselves. To say, today is not a good day. I need to auto regulate and say, Paul gave me this range. I'm going to go at the bottom end of the range just to make sure I got some work in.
But isn't that's the goal?
That's the goal for sure.
So then you don't go away from the goal just because it's a little bit hard in the beginning, right? As a coach, it's your job to communicate that. And
you meet them where they are, though. You meet them where they are. You have to give them a little bit of it at the beginning. See if they can educate them throughout the process, right? So you give them a little bit, you educate. Then you give them a little bit more autonomy, a little bit more autonomy, a little bit more autonomy. But
you never digress the actual point where you're trying to elicit autonomy, right? I mean, I've had lifters like, I just can't do, all I can do is percentages. And I'm like, well, then you're probably not the right lifter for me, because if you don't want to take the effort to gauge and become a better lifter through autonomous lifting, then you're not really ever going to make it to your full potential. So clearly you're just set in your ways. And if you're not able to digress or diverge from percentages to learn a new way of doing things, what else are you going to kick back on as well as an athlete, right? So that's one of the things I always look at in terms of gauging whether or not I want to work with that athlete, is like, how open are they to learning new things and to being creative within their thought process, is something that I always think about as a coach athlete.
I see. I like to be a bit more malleable in my approach. Like if someone doesn't want to work with RPE, I won't make them. If someone doesn't want to work with percentages, I won't make them. I usually use a bit of a blend of the two. You know, hey, we're going to do a five sets of five. I'd like a top set at RPE 8, but your first set has to be at 65%. So I know that at least I'm getting, if the person stays at 65%, at least I did a 5x5 at 65%. I tend to often to have just the lifter themselves track their own numbers throughout the process, because a lot of the way I do, especially off seasons, is base progressions off of top sets. So as long as the person records their top sets, they base future percentages and future weeks off of that top set. And I always work sub-maximal, especially for the main work. But I think and for me, that helps me monitor total volume within a week, total working volume within a week.
And it makes sense because you're still incorporating. But I'm saying if somebody is like completely just like, I don't want to do RPs, I'm like you, I would find a way to meet them in the middle to do percent. Yeah. I do like the way that I do the same thing where you'll throw in things and that's the markers that you go by off. Because so many people use, what'd you do at your last meet? And then that's their entire off season, and there's no undulation because they're not willing to, right? So it's like, I agree with you. You're constantly trying to see where they're at this point in time to create that adaptation. And if you don't continue to look at those progression schemes, then you're not able to actually pick out the weights or pick out the RPE that person needs to work at for that given point in time, understanding that what they peaked for is not necessarily where they're at right now.
Yeah. How do you feel about like indicator lifts? Do you ever use indicators? Like, oh, I know that for this person, their floor press tends to be about 5% heavier than their max bench.
Yeah.
So
dynamic correspondence for sure. Yeah.
So you do that kind of stuff?
Yeah. If they're not able to actually do the competition lift, then I have to have some type of variation in there that elicits the the dynamic correspondence. So if that lift goes up, then their lift, but that takes years with that athlete, right? Like I know when I was training with Dan, he never did back squats, or he rarely did back squats in his off season. He did front squats because he knew that if he can improve his front squat, his back squat would improve within 200 pounds of that as well. So if he could front squat 500, he always knew that he could back squat 700. And then it was always a 1-to-1 trend for him in ratio. So that always worked out, no matter how strong he got at a front squat, his back squat always went up 200 pounds from there. So that was something that he found out through years and years of training it, right? So it does take a while. But if I'm not familiar with that athlete and I don't have those variations dialed in, but we are using variations to build up a main lift because maybe we're trying to work on some problem areas, kind of like what you're saying, right?
Yep.
I would throw in a low bar squat, maybe periodically, maybe start with a very small single so they get used to that bar being on their back again in that position and seeing if there's anything that presents itself there. And then in a couple of weeks, do the heavier single because they had the bar on their back. So maybe it'd be like 6 weeks of a variation, and then maybe a pivot week with a low bar squat, 1 or 2 weeks of that at like 70%, and then go back to that variation, and then 2 weeks of the heavier ones just to see where they're at. That way it's not so much, there's still some skill acquisition component to it as well. There's some neurological component that they're actually getting back into the movement, because some people they'll be like, man, I haven't done a low bar squat in forever, so it feels weird. I'm like, how does it, like, you just did a high bar squat, like you just moved the bar 4 inches. Why does it feel so weird? And I know there's a lot of people that are like that, and I just assume that they're telling the truth because I don't ever notice a difference at all. If I go from a high bar squat or a safety squat bar squat, and I'm like, oh, low bar squat, it's not like I have to relearn how to do it. It's just there. I just know how to do it. Right. But some people feel like they have to, and I get it, but
Yep.
it's just not, I think it's more of a psychological thing. And we're not really ever answering any of these people's questions. We're just going on tangents after
I love it
tangents.
though. But here's the thing. We don't get the opportunity to chat like about this kind of stuff. So, I mean, as often as I would like I don't, people I work with every day that want to talk about squatting.
That's true. But we did have a question that kind of correlates to this too, about the volume landmarks as well. Can you read that off?
Sure. So the question is super simple. It's, do you use volume landmarks for the 3 lifts? And I know where this question's coming from. It's just a buddy of mine, Louis, who he coaches very much in like a DUP style.
Explain volume landmarks first.
So a volume landmark is essentially establishing the total number of working sets within a week on a given movement pattern, and seeing how that affects your recovery and your performance as you move forward.
And to my knowledge, this is more of a theoretical concept than something that's actually been proven in the literature, correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Very, very anecdotal. My biggest problem with having any type of volume landmark guidelines is that it's so individual, and it's a lot of different factors, from how large the like any type of population variant, like size, absolute strength, gender, limb length, experience, it all plays a factor. So I think establishing volume landmarks per person is really important. So, I have lifters that can deadlift twice a week, relatively heavy, for, let's say, 7 total sets, and they have no issue. But I have a lifter who might not be able to tolerate four or more total working sets.
Right.
But that might change if I transition from that 60 to 70% range to that 70 to 80% range.
Mm-hmm.
And it always changes. So this was a question that came up in one of our Q&As for Coaches Corner University, talking about like increasing frequency, because increasing frequency could increase your volume landmarks. But what ends up happening is, if you go from 8 total sets in 2 days to 8 total sets in 3 days, but then all 3 days automatically they start getting heavier at the same time, right, your ability to tolerate those 3 days of that movement completely goes out the window. So I think volume landmarks are important to note, but they're not going to be something that you can apply broadly across all of your lifters. It has to be an individual lifter thing. And you have to kind of have in the back of your head, looking at training as a calculus equation with multiple variables, and only trying to change 1 or 2 variables at a time, so that you know if it's working or not. Because if you change too many things at once, you don't know what's working, you don't know what's broken.
Yeah. And I think conceptually, the volume landmarks can lend some credence with the idea that each individual is going to have a amount of volume that is the least amount they can adapt to. So that may be their deload volume, right? And that person, typically from what I've seen, their recovery ability, it pretty much stays the same, right? There's some things that can ebb and flow it a couple sets here and there, like stress, poor sleep, lifestyle stuff. But you got to assume that people who are paying for a coach are also trying to fix all those things accordingly as well. They're trying to sleep appropriately. They're not going out on the weekends partying, getting hammered, then paying $200 a month for a coach to continue to give them a program, right? They're usually getting their stuff together. So you would assume that their recovery ability doesn't really undulate a lot, maybe 2 to 3 sets a week, I would say. So once you have that maximum recoverable volume, is the idea of like, maybe that's their deload volume. So if they're getting beat up, we can drop it down to that volume so that we're still eliciting some type of adaptation. And I think that's what a lot of people get wrong with deloads, is you'll see them, the typical, because Jim Wendler did it, so now everyone does it, and that's like, here's your custom program, 3 sets of 5 at 50%. It's like, wait, that's 5-3-1. Why am I deloading?
Or even Brian, 5 singles at 50%.
Right. And it's like, how does that make a deload at all, right? And it doesn't, because everyone's going to be different. And if you have, the idea is like to always have an amount of volume that's going to create some type of adaptation. So once you find their bare minimum, then you can find their maximum adaptive volume, right? That's like the sweet spot. because, you know, you look at there was a debate going on between Israel and another guy, somebody that works for him. I don't know. He doesn't talk much. Uh, and then they were debating against Brian Miner and Eric Helms on the idea that you build your volume up to a certain point and then you deload, right? So it's easier. It's like RIR of 3 building its way up to RIR of 0. And Eric Helms and Brian Miner were saying, well, if we have this idea of like, this is the best volume that creates the most adaptation, but it's not like the maximum recoverable volume to where they have to deload every week, but we find that sweet spot. Why not just stay at that sweet spot, right? So if you can say you do 12 sets of squats and that's where you can squat at, you know, between 60 and 80%, you can do 12 sets of squats. Why start off at 6 sets and then work your way up to 14? Why not just stay at 12 sets the entire time? And there's a lot of validity to that, in my opinion, right? If you look at a lot of the bodybuilders who are doing a lot of the training nowadays, and a lot of the strength athletes like Mike Teixeira, who does the emergent strategies, where it's like, look, this block yielded great results. This is like your maximum adaptive volume. That is like the sweet spot for you. Let's just do that again. Why would we need to undulate anything? Why not just continue to repeat and keep nailing where it is that you're perfectly able to adapt from, that creates the best training stimulus to where you're not getting beat up, but you're making progress, to where you don't have to be forced into a deload and all those things. Why not just continue to run that same block, right? And that's kind of the conceptual ideas that I get from the volume landmarks, is each person has a minimum, each person has a maximum adaptive, and each person has a maximum recoverability, which you never really, why even bother getting there? That's where the highest risk of injury comes from, because that's when you're at your most fatigued. So if you can find that maximum adaptive volume for each person, then you know exactly within that realm of like, these are the amount of sets this person can handle. It never really changed. It makes it so much more predictable. So then just progress that in a progressively overload manner, right? So maybe you do a 5-week block where you're at 75, and then you go to 85% within training, and then you go, and then the next block you do 72.5 to 87.5, like, but all within that same volume landmark, right? To me, that makes the most sense when you're thinking about volume landmarks. It's not the idea of starting at the bottom and then chasing to the top. And then once you get to the top, if you survive, you deload, and then you just do it all over again. My idea would be like, well, this is the area where I get the most amount of adaptation. Why not just start there and end there?
Definitely would have less risk associated with it, right? Because you're taking smaller jumps,
Right.
in terms of average intensity of the block. I think the biggest misconception with people is that a deload week is a week off, is a week that you're not adapting. And what I've had a lot of success with is using that first week of any training block as the benchmark for a deload week. So you say you do 5 weeks of training. You go back to that first week and you say, well, we did 5 weeks. So that first week would probably be a deload at this point. So you go back to that. And then using that as kind of a guiding principle. So as your average intensity of training climbs, it would dictate that the average intensity of your deload would need to come up so that there's no decrease in fitness when you go back to your training intensities.
Right.
And that's the happy medium to be found. But in going back to what you said about the volume landmarks, so if you did say a 7-week block from 75 to 85, and then you repeated it at 77 to 87, and you just kind of went back and forth, you're kind of doing the same thing as the working all the way up and coming back down, working all the way up, coming back down. You're going to get to that same spot, but with less risk, because you're not pushing that maximal recoverable number.
And more time within that volume range that produces the best results.
Yeah, right.
Right. So that's the idea, is like, yeah, you're going to eventually get to that point, but you're taking less risk and you're constantly training in an adaptation spot that creates the best adaptation possible. You don't start low and then work your way high to where maybe the last 2 weeks are the best 2 weeks of the block, and the first 2 weeks, right? And that's how a lot of people program, not actually knowing that. They'll do a shitty deload, and then their lifter will come back the next week when it starts the block, and then that's their actual deload, and that feels like shit too. So you just took a 2-week deload and you didn't really get anything out of it, right? So that's where my thought process goes to, and like all this stuff is theoretical in nature. There's no science to vindicate or back up any of this stuff, but to me, logically, that makes the most sense, right? You're lowering the risk of injury, and you're constantly training in a block of, this is the best amount of volume that your body can adapt to. So why would you go below it, and why would you go above it, right? The risk of going below it means that you're not training to your optimal capacity. The risk of going above it means, yeah, you're training in a much harder, much fatigued state. So you might be able to eke out a little bit more adaptation, but you also have a higher risk of injury as well.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you at all. I think the only barrier to running a system like that is, hey coach, are we going to change anything?
It's working. What do you want to change stuff? I hate when people do that,
Exactly.
man.
I know. But people are going to people.
I'll get people who are doing nutrition and they're dieting and they're like losing 0.5 pound every check-in, and they check in twice a week. He's like, hey, are we gonna, like, do we need to change anything? Like, no, man, you're losing 0.5 pound each week. What do you want to change? Like, you're losing weight, you're making progress.
Yeah.
Shouldn't it be faster? No, why would it be faster? And at least I can give them like science to back it up.
Yeah,
like, hey, this is the science that tells you don't want to go faster. With strength training, there's not a lot of science to back things up quite yet in terms of that. But then it's just like, look, you're making progress every week.
Yeah.
Every time we do this, every time we put in an indicator, you're blowing it out of the water. What more do you want to do?
Yeah, but then you run into like, okay, so say you do change something. What if that totally fucks up your volume landmarks? Like you go from I don't know, a deficit deadlift to a low handle trap bar. So similar range of motion. You likely will be able to handle a little bit more load on the low handle trap bar, but then all of a sudden that additional stressor means you can't handle as much deadlifting and you start under recovering.
Maybe.
But here's the caveat to that is, in that instance, I only change one variable.
Right.
So I know exactly where I need to look to adjust and accommodate for that variable. So a system like that works terrific.
Yeah, but that's all about exercise selection, right?
Right.
It's like you set a deficit.
Yeah, like a 1 inch deficit.
All right, so you have a deficit deadlift with the bar out in front of you. So from a fatigue standpoint, that's going to elicit a little bit more lower back fatigue. That's going to be a little bit more range of motion, a little bit, not a lot, a little bit more range of motion and less load. But because it's out in front of you, neurologically, that may demand more. It may feel harder, right? And a lot of people go by based on how it feels, right? But if you look at the research, it'll show fatigue markers on deadlift and squat are relatively the same, but because deadlifts just feel heavier, they hurt a little bit more, people assume that they create more fatigue, right? But, so then you pick the movement that maybe allowed you to lift a little bit more weight, but doesn't really require as much lower back fatigue. So like a trap bar would be a perfect variation to move to if you found that trap bars were a relatively good movement for you, right? So same thing, right? You went from a 1 inch deficit, now you're going to a regular deadlift, right? There's not much of a variation change. So would that really change your adapt?
It's semantics. But
if you went from like a 2 inch deficit to like a 4 inch block pull, those variations are so huge that you would have to, and that's just poor coaching, right? That's like, why did this variation come from? Like, where did it come from? No, there's no actual progression.
Why?
Right. It's like, well, I just thought it'd be fun to put in there for a block or two. It's like,
I love that.
I don't pay
Can we try this?
Right.
Can we try this, coach? No.
Never.
No fun.
Never. Progress is what we seek, not fun.
Exactly.
So next question, we might get to 3. This will be good.
Yeah.
Frequent dieters no longer losing weight and gaining, steps to rebuild. So this is an interesting one because if you look at all the research and literature, they'll tell you no matter what, if you're in a calorie deficit, you're going to lose weight. 99% of the studies will show that if you're in a deficit, you'll lose weight. And a lot of those studies don't necessarily look at like the hormone. They don't look at this type of stuff, this metabolic adaptation, this female triad that can happen from consistent dieters. And it happens more so with with women when they start dieting. So if you look at the research, it doesn't really give you a lot of answers, but then you have to start digging into more of the functional medicine side of things, which I know is a taboo topic for people who like focus on research, because it's like functional medicine. That's like
Mhm.
woo-woo stuff, but it's not. There's some good things to it as well. So you want to think like, well, what are some of the long-term ramifications of long-term dieting for, especially for females, right? And the research will show that the more you're in a deficit, the more your hormones are going to start to go down, your thyroid's going to go down, your metabolic rate is going to start to go down, your ability to maintain muscle is going to start to decrease, which is why your metabolic rate starts to go down as well. So let's say you've dieted for 2 years chronically, and you started your diet at 115 pounds of muscle, but then you've chronically dieted for 2 years, you're probably going to be down to like 101 pounds. You might have lost 10 pounds of muscle, right? So then you get to the point where your body is just becoming very efficient with what it has. It doesn't have that muscle to boost the metabolic rate anymore. It doesn't have the food to boost the metabolic rate anymore. Your hormones are all starting to shut down. Your thyroid's going down, which is another regulator of your metabolism. Your thyroid, and then you're also your testosterone, your estrogen. So you're gonna have fluctuations in that. You'll probably end up losing your period, which is a sign of health for a lot of people,
Mhm.
a lot of women. So those are all the markers that start to tank. So the idea that you can continuously tank those things and then see progress by creating more stress onto your body, right? Because every time you're in a dieting phase, that is a stressful situation. So as stress starts to rise, you have the progesterone still, where your body and the HPA axis starts to discommunicate, to where progesterone is starting to get pulled for cortisol, is pulling your progesterone. So then you have low progesterone, high estrogen. So then you become estrogen dominant, right? And then all these metabolic factors is why your body's no longer able to start to keep losing weight, right? So that's the absolute worst thing you can do, and that's the most negative thing you can do. And then you'll start retaining a little bit of water. Then you'll start gaining a little bit more fat, because stress helps store fat a little bit easier. Stress helps create more insulin resistance. So then you can have this idea of becoming diabetic and lower calories as well. So there's a lot of issues that attenuate that. And same thing with men, right? As you diet down, your testosterone starts to go into the tank. So then you have higher levels of depression, low libido, and those type of issues. And when you start doing that, your desire to move more, your desire to create energy, to create a deficit, starts to go down as well. So then you get into that same issue of trying to do things in an inefficient manner, right? So that your body is working against you the entire time. And then also too, the fact that as you're getting lower and lower into calories, your body does tend to adapt to that as well. So then once your body adapts to that, when it has that type of metabolic adaptation, it becomes harder and harder to elicit a response out of it. So the term chronic dieting is something that gets kind of like pushed to the side, like, oh, calorie, you're not chronic dieting because you're not losing weight, right? And they'll be like, you're just cheating on your diet. And it's like, no, you can't just accuse everyone of cheating on their diet all the time, because you don't have
Right.
the answers to it. Which as a coach, like that's one of my biggest pet peeves, is accusing your clients of stuff just because you're not intelligent enough to create the answers that they're looking for.
Mhm.
But those are kind of the negative ramifications of frequent dieters and why they're not losing weight anymore. So if you want to rebuild that up, there's like these thresholds that you want to get to, and it's energy availability, what Lyle McDonald talks about a lot. And as soon as you start to get below the EA number, then that's when all these hormonal things happen. That's when all the triad stuff happens. So you want to try to increase your calories, decrease your activity, so that you're back into that energy availability number. Something that I've seen that may not be antiquated by data is around 2,000 calories for women. If you can get a woman up to about 2,000 calories and reduce their intensity of training for a little bit, that's kind of like the sweet spot for them to be at from a calorie place. And men, anywhere between 3 to 3,500 calories seems to be the sweet spot, to where you can start reversing some of those bad trends and some of those tendencies, but you have to be there for quite some time, depending
Mhm.
on how long you've been dieting for. So that's kind of the idea behind it. And then to fix it, you want to start increasing the calories, and you want to start decreasing the actual high intensity activity, but maybe increasing the overall activity more from a parasympathetic standpoint than a sympathetic standpoint.
Yep. Yeah, everything you said, totally true. I've anecdotally have seen it the same with clients who come to me in this chronically dieted state. Hey, my maintenance calories are 1400. I'm like, okay, let's try to get that up a little bit. And the biggest barrier that I run into, especially at the beginning, once they understand that what we're doing has a purpose and that it's a long-term commitment to their health and well-being, is I don't want to gain weight.
Yeah.
Is I don't want to be gaining fat, and helping them to understand that it doesn't have to happen right away, right? So this, when we say getting a client to 2000 calories, doesn't mean that if that client came to me with 1400, I'm getting them to 2000 immediately.
Right.
It's a slow process. Getting them to eliminate or limit their high intensity exercise, it's a slow process. You don't want to push anything too fast. You know, if you're lifting 5 days a week, let's go down to 4. Let's include more walking.
Right.
Let's keep that metabolic furnace. Let's keep giving it some reason to burn, right? But it doesn't necessarily have to be maximal exercise all the time. And once they start to feel better, that's the buy-in.
Right.
Right. So as soon as they start feeling better, they're like, wow, like I definitely realize what I've done to myself. It's great that I'm starting to fix it. You can start to look at, you know, a little bit of supplementation to help the process along, you know, different things to help with insulin sensitivity, like berberine. You know, I'm an organ support formula. Equilibrium would be a terrific supplement to include in this type of intervention, not because, you know, you want to protect the organ systems, you want to support the organ systems during this. The body is under so much stress in a chronically dieted individual. It's trying to survive.
Right.
Right. We're trying to achieve some level of homeostasis. However dysfunctional that homeostasis is, we need to sustain life. You know, that starvation mode, whatever you want to call it, right? So this is as a coach, this is a very tenuous situation for you, and the way that in which you handle it could greatly affect this individual's life. If you are not comfortable doing that for somebody, refer out.
Yeah.
Right off the bat. If you're not comfortable having these conversations, you know, talking to your female clients about their periods, talking to them about their, you know, their pain. If they're not comfortable talking to you about it, that's a problem. And never, like you said, never ever assume that this person is doing something that, you know, to deliberately derail their progress.
Right.
And then another question that needs to be asked as a coach is, in this situation, is, are you dealing with someone who has a disordered eating behavior?
Mm-hmm.
If so, and that's a conversation that needs to be had. If it comes out that this person is actively anorexic or actively bulimic, Tony or myself or anyone who isn't a clinician is not equipped to deal with that.
100%.
You absolutely have to refer out. When it comes to somebody who is maybe in remission from that sort of thing, has their eating habits under control. I actually had a client who I was working with her psychologist on her nutrition, because they felt that it would be something helpful to get her out of the spiral. And it ended up being, but it's a very delicate process. So understanding the underlying science of what's going on in the chronic dieter's body is terrific. How you handle it, the soft skills you implement with that person are paramount. And at the end of the day, the goal shouldn't be, I need to get this person's calories up so I can bring them right back down.
Right.
It's, I want to get this person's calories back up so that we can reverse this metabolic adaptation to a point where, hey, we're putting on some muscle mass again, their resting metabolic rate is coming up, and I don't need to bring their calories back down for them to lose body fat.
Right.
Because eventually that's going to happen. As soon as you bring their calories up, the resting metabolic rate is going to come up, their hormones are going to get back into more of a balanced situation. You can start to include more high intensity activity into the equation again. You have more stimulus for hypertrophy, you have more stimulus for fat loss at that point, even at maintenance. And you're in a position where this person's body composition will start shifting.
Right.
Without having to change their calories or macros around.
Right. Yeah. Because I mean, you look at the recomp literature, or the literature that actually has recomposition in it. You know, there's actually been shown quite a few times to recomp in highly trained individuals as well, right? And for that same reason, as your calories goes up, your daily activity is going to increase as well. You're going to fidget more, you're going to do more things. And then, yeah, your body just starts to recomp because you're performing at a higher level, and that's going to require more demand on your body. So it's definitely a positive thing, but you just have to create that buy-in. Like Paul said, you have to be able to explain everything that's going on to the point that they understand it so that they can buy in to fully make those transitions, but never be that coach where if you can't get someone to buy in to just say, all right, well, we'll just try it and see what happens, right? Because it's, you know, you don't want to, then you're dieting them down to like 1,200 calories to 1,000 calories, right? And you're just be exasperating the problem because you're not able to communicate effectively.
That's a conversation I have quite often. You know, Paul, can we reduce my calories? I think I can go to 1,400. And I was like, that's great, but where are you going to go from there?
Right.
1,300, 1,200.
Yeah.
Like this
2
is
hours
this,
of cardio.
Yeah. Like,
what are we going to have to do?
This, if you want to maintain this physique that we're after, has to be slow. I've seen
also,
like
too, without, sorry to interrupt, but the idea of like what their physique, what is their physique they're trying to go after, right? Everyone has this idea of like a certain number or a certain this or a certain that. And that's really important to communicate with your athlete as well, right? Is like making sure that their goals actually align with their goals. Right? I've had people that say, I want to lose 10 pounds. And I was like, all right, well, what if we lose 5 pounds and you have abs, but if we lose 10 pounds and you're just skinny fat, which one would you rather choose? And they're like, I'd rather choose abs and 5 pounds. Like, yeah, so your goal is you want to look a certain way. You don't want to weigh a certain weight, right? So let's focus on looking that way instead of the scale being the indicator of success, right? So I think that's one of the things you really have to like dig in and extrapolate from that person so that you know exactly what their goal is. Because very rarely is it ever a number on a scale unless they're trying to make a weight class. But then a lot of people who try to make a weight class, they're just trying to make a weight class so they look better, right? The goal is 99% of the time, the goal is to look better, not to weigh a certain weight. They just think that that weight is going to make them look better.
Yeah, man. It's the same conversations over and over again, but it is the, you know, the quote unquote diet culture that's been perpetuated as, you know, the scale is the only measure that we can use. And, you know, I have, you know, weight class athletes that are hanging out, like we're like 2 to 3 pounds away from their weight class. And I'm like, hey, let's keep eating.
Right.
Like, oh, no, I can't. I have to make weight. I'm like, yeah, in 9 months.
Right. What are we just going to hang out here until then?
Yeah, I mean, that's cool with me. But, you know, the goal should always be to carry the most amount of muscle mass you can, because that's going to be the, you know, I should say most amount of muscle mass you can within a certain threshold if you want to be healthy. I mean, like lean mass is a big predictor of longevity as we get older.
Beyond that, right? You just want to be able to feel good and perform at a high level. You don't want to feel like you're constantly drained all the time too, right? Like you're a performance athlete, eat like one is the biggest thing I tell people. If you want to do physique stuff, do fucking physique stuff. But 99% of people are performance athletes. So that's,
I think on that note, like I think a lot of people have this misconception of how lean they would have to be in order to be shredded. It's like, bro, like if I lose 10 pounds, shredded. I'm like, listen,
30 pounds later, they're still not there.
Well, it's the same. Like you know, I've died down a couple times to get quite lean. Like this summer I got pretty lean and I was sitting around like 216 pounds, like pretty vascular, like very visible abs, like 24/7. And I was like, if I ever wanted to step on stage, I'd probably have to lose another 10 to 15 pounds. And I'm miserable right now. So I was like, definitely don't want to do that anytime soon.
It's a different breed of human being, the people that step on stage. Yeah. All right, that's all we have for today, guys. We appreciate you listening. If you like the episode, please go to iTunes and leave a review and a 5-star rating. You can find it at Beyond the Platform. If you guys are interested in supporting the podcast, check out coachescorneru.com. We have the membership site that is up and live, and we have over a dozen videos already on there, closer to 20 right now. And we're releasing new ones every single week. We have contributors coming on. We have frequent Q&As twice a week. So we have a lot of content And then we also have a community platform where you can go in and ask any questions and have myself and Paul respond at a moment's notice. So if you guys are interested in that, it's only $34.99. Check it out, coachescorneru.com. And then check out Subject Zero supplements. If you want any of the supplements that we offer, sleep aid, stim-free nootropic, stim-free pre-workout, all-around health supplement, intra-workout and hydration formula. Check out subjectzerosups.com and you can use the code BEYOND10 to get any type of 10% off on any of the products that we offer. And then also check out MetroLife if you guys are interested in a marker to help with subjective health and mental health and in the subjective areas, more like a daily journal to make sure that you're on track with what you need to be on track with. A lot of good reminders, a lot of good ways to continue to proceed beyond just what you're doing inside the weight room. So make sure you check them out. And anything else?
Bacon and barbells.
Baconandbarbells.co. Make sure you check them out. If you type in .com, it's not going to take you to the right website. I made that mistake the other day. Baconandbarbells.co. Yes.
Yep. Use
Check
code
them out.
Paul10.
There you go, Paul10. And I think they just dropped, or they're about to drop their new line.
Better Luck Next Life. Yeah.
Yeah. Did that one drop already, or are they about to? Okay, yeah.
Yep.
So check that out. It's a really cool line, guys. Make sure you support them. They support a lot of powerlifters in Canada, and they also support a lot of the powerlifting culture in the United States as well. And they're ran by an amazing human being. So support those that support the podcast. And we appreciate you guys for listening. Keep asking those questions, and we'll catch you next week.